Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dima Atanasova from Lancaster University. Dima, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you today. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Mhm. So I am Dimitrinka Atanasova or Dima Atanasova as I prefer, and I am senior lecturer in intercultural communication at Lancaster University. I am based at the Department of Linguistics and English Language. And yeah, in that role, I have been interacting with international students, home students, as we call them, in various capacities, undergraduate, MA students, PhD students. We have visiting researchers as well. That's very briefly who I am.
So, a lot of work with language and intercultural competence, and a lot of experience of working with international students. I'm always full of admiration for students who come to study in the UK who speak English as their second language. What, in your experience, are some of the challenges that they can face when they come to study in UK higher education?
Mhm. Um, Again, this is not based on official research, which I have done, but during my time at Lancaster University, for about 4 or 5 years, I was director of studies of some of the on-campus MA programs. And in that capacity, students would often come to talk to me, to share their experiences, not necessarily complain. And some of the things which international students often say are things like they have difficulty understanding just the content in the lecture. Um, they find it very useful if the lecture had been recorded to go back and listen to certain parts because of the language, because of the terminology which was used. Very often, they also mention the speed. And what is interesting, they mention the speed and the language, like the terminology and structure, complexity of sentences more often than accent, which is very comforting to me because somebody whose English is not their first language, I always worry about my accent as the thing that will be most difficult for people to understand. But interestingly, in my experience, it has been more just the speed of talking and the complexity of the structure of the sentences. Um, that's one thing. Another thing which they share is that because maybe of some kind of inferiority complex, international students often say to me that they feel they are not being valued by the tutors. They feel when they start participating in class, which they generally find more difficult, maybe because they are coming from a different education system, they sometimes find it that when they start talking, they feel that other classmates who are English speakers or lecturers who are whose first language is English, they don't have the patience to listen to them, and they don't value what they say. Um, so these are some of the issues which have regularly come up.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting, and um, you were saying that these are impressions you formed, evidence you have based on conversations with students. So it's not a
Mhm.
formal academic study, but based on many years' experience as director of studies
Yeah.
within an English language and linguistics
Yeah.
department.
And one of them is really funny. I will just say, because we have reading week, when students don't have classes at MA level, they have time to catch up with their readings. And during that reading week, I was traveling to Dublin. And I went to the airport, Manchester airport, and suddenly I heard somebody shouting, Dima, Dima, and it was a group of international Chinese students. They were traveling to Belfast to go for a short trip. And we just sat around and they started saying like, Dima, I hope it's okay can I tell you that? Well, I go to this class and I don't understand anything. So it's really informal. It has
Yeah.
been very informal.
And I suppose a lot of that will be the skill and success in building up that relationship where people can feel comfortable to be open about issues that they're facing, which is really rather lovely in a sense,
Mhm.
isn't it? Um,
Mhm.
I've often tended to find, in my experience of working with international students, that there's always a sense that if there's a problem with communication, the student will say, "Ah, it's my fault. My English isn't good
Yeah.
enough," and therefore you tend not to find these formal, structured complaints.
Mhm.
I very rarely hear of cases where somebody has left a lecture which they couldn't understand and decided to write an email to the head of school saying this lecturer's English is not appropriate for the cohort. They need to slow down and use simple sentences. That doesn't happen. It's normally students actually saying, well, it must be my fault. My English isn't quite good enough. And yet, when you start talking with people informally and you have that trust, the issue opens up and becomes more obvious that maybe it's a two-way responsibility for that communication.
Yeah, that is very true. So students usually, that's what I have also observed. They would say like, I know it's my fault. I have to study more. I have to work more. And yes, just generally international students who have been more sort of flagging up that it works both ways. I find that they tend to be, maybe if we can say, more mature MA students. So they have already worked somewhere. They maybe are in some professional role. So they have a bit more confidence to say, yes, I know I'm only learning, but the content is mainly with examples from England, or that's too fast, or that's too complex, or something like that. But the majority of students, they would put it on themselves as a development, yeah, issue. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it takes a certain amount of self-confidence,
Mm-hmm.
which perhaps comes from life experience, to be
Mm-hmm.
assertive enough to
Yeah.
say that this is a joint problem and I would like you to
Yeah.
improve rather than putting all the responsibility on me. Yeah, I can understand that. What you were saying, you mentioned three things: speed, complexity, and then you went on to talk about a feeling of value. They do seem to be quite major potential barriers to learning success in
Mm-hmm.
some ways. At the very least, one imagines that international students will have to work even harder than home students in order to be able to access and understand content. The fact that, as we've been saying, in general, international students, by which I mean those who speak English as a second language, are perhaps less likely to complain. That must make it rather difficult for members of staff as well, because in a way, if you don't know that there is a problem, then you can't really start to rectify it. And I'd like to come on to talk a little bit more about staff approaches and how staff can help in a moment. But let's just go back to what you were saying about lectures in particular. You mentioned speed and
Mm-hmm.
complexity. Can we just break that down? Let's take speed first of all. Presumably, students are saying, these lecturers are just talking too fast. In simple terms, why is that a problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, why is it a problem? I suppose it really is a big problem, and it is a big problem because you are given new information, um, and when it comes at speed, you just don't have the ability to process it properly, even when it's in your own language, first language that you have been exposed to for a long time. When it's in a second language or third language, for a lot of our students, English can be even their third language. It is a problem because, yeah, oftentimes we introduce very complex theories which are new. And when we do this really quick, we're not really giving our students the chance to learn. Um, yeah, so speed is often something that students do mention. Sometimes they also mention, which is perhaps related to speed, that um, slides can have too much content. So they don't really know where to look because there is a lot of content on the slide. And that combined with speed is a problem. Um, Sometimes students even say things like, for particular lecturers, that they need to finish. They're checking the time and there's only that much time left and they need to finish. But they say like, but I didn't understand anything from the last 10 minutes. So they finished, they think they did what they had to do. Was it successful? Maybe not so much. So speed is really an issue.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So it's giving people time, and this includes home students too, I would have thought, the time they need to process new information. And that is best done by speaking more slowly.
yeah.
And
Home students as well. Yeah, sorry
mm,
to interrupt you. Yes, home
no, no,
students as well. And I recently, I think I had from home student also um something along the lines that they even use those words. They said like, I dread going into that lecture. I dread going in there because I know I will not understand very much. So that's really clearly not the right attitude to be going in.
yes.
And I think recording lectures, it seems to have helped a lot, which is like we've inherited as a practice from COVID. Um, yeah, I'm always amazed to hear how many students find it useful to go back and listen to recorded lectures again. Yeah, so
I
probably
can
we
just
need some kind of training how to pace ourselves.
yes, I think it's a very natural thing um, to speak very quickly when you're enthusiastic about a subject, when you're knowledgeable about a subject, and you've got a lot to say. And your example of, we typically have 50-minute academic hours, don't we? So we'll start 10 minutes after the student's supposed to arrive to give them time to get there, and we'll finish a bit early to give them time to go to the next lecture. And trying to squeeze everything in to that time. It feels natural. I've got all this to say, so I'll say it quickly. But of course, if people are not understanding, you might as well not say anything at all.
Mm,
Um, and I was when I was listening to you talking about even home students saying there's too much on the slides.
mhm,
I personally can really relate to that. I actually went to, I won't name the institution, but I
mhm,
went to a public lecture the other day, and the audience was a mixture of academics and private sector individuals like myself. It was delivered by actually a very, very highly qualified, well regarded lecturer in his field. And he put up this slide, 5 paragraphs of quotes about a subject he had just introduced. This was a new topic for us. And he said, I'm going to give you some context. Here are 5 quotes about this subject. And you've got 5 paragraphs to read on that slide. And he joked. He said, I know we shouldn't put too much text on the screen, but I've done it anyway. Ha ha ha. We all laughed because we kind of knew that that's what people do.
mm,
But then I sat there at the back and I thought, this is rubbish,
mhm,
absolute rubbish, because I cannot read this quickly enough just to put the words in my head, let alone think about them, understand them, and reflect on them.
mm,
And I like to think I'm a fairly highly literate, reasonably intelligent native English speaker. What chance have other people got when there's an additional language barrier in place? So, yes, your example there resonates with me quite strongly from my recent experience.
mhm.
So we talked about speed then, and in a sense, information overload
Yeah,
as
yeah.
one of the problems that students who speak English as a second language experience, particularly in lectures. You also mentioned the complexity of language. Now, this is really interesting because all students who come to study in the UK, whether it be at bachelor's or master's level, have to pass English language exams before they are allowed onto the course. And part of that looks at vocabulary and looks at grammar. So one would expect students to be at the correct level of English to be able to understand complex sentences. So can you just tell me a little bit more? What are the issues of complex sentences or complex
Okay.
language? Why can't students understand them?
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
question.
Um, no, I think I probably said it not in the best way. Um, yeah, complex more in the sense of using more colloquial expressions.
Okay.
So something like let's keep the ball rolling, or do you want to have a second bite at the cherry? So students generally they would understand things like inflation rates went through the roof. So yeah, but some of the more colloquial expressions, some of the metaphors, and we combine that with speed, oftentimes they don't really understand. And yeah, a lot of the time they wouldn't ask either, because we as lecturers often say, "Do you have any questions?" But we have to imagine that they're with their classmates. Nobody wants to feel like I'm the only one who misunderstood. So I find it that probably um, a lot of the time um, these just remain misunderstood or not understood. But yeah, what I mean is more in the sense of like colloquial language and also examples which are, of course, like maybe we should try to give examples which are more international, because if we give an example only with something relating to England, um, not everyone is familiar with the history or the event or yeah. So in that sense, so maybe complex wasn't really the most appropriate way to, yeah, to define the problem.
Okay,
Yeah,
so it's colloquialisms, it's
yeah,
idioms,
yeah,
the whole nine yards. Let's
hmm,
don't let the cat out of the bag, that sort of
yeah,
thing. Which, with an idiom, of course, by definition, you cannot work out the meaning from the individual words. You either know it or you don't. And I think, as native speakers, and this is probably true of all languages, we use them a lot
hmm,
without thinking about them. They're quite convenient for us when we're speaking, but they don't necessarily, um, as it were, translate or are understood by people that haven't encountered them before. They can be quite difficult. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your point about using examples or
hmm,
cultural reference points that are UK specific is really interesting, given the work that is going on in many institutions about internationalizing the curriculum. And so I think what you're saying is that there's a danger in assuming that people are automatically going to relate to references which are particular to the UK.
hmm,
And therefore, perhaps it might be more appropriate either to explain those
yeah,
or to use more international reference points to include everyone within the learning experience. I think that's what I understood from what you
yes,
were saying there.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
mm,
what we said so far, I think, focuses particularly on what students have been reflecting on in terms of their experiences in lectures. What about other aspects of, let's say, staff-student interaction in
hmm.
seminars, in tutorials? Um, what's your experience of student perceptions of that generally in terms of language?
Hmm. I haven't heard too many um too many comments about seminars. I think most of the comments I've heard from students have related to lectures. Um, in seminars, well, one of the things which I do in one of my lectures, I have a teamwork. assessment where I try to mix students based on usually that class is fairly small. I usually have about 15 students, so I speak to the students and try to find out more about what is their first language, where do they come from, what was their previous education background, was it in linguistics or something else. And then when I form the groups, I try to mix them based on all of these things like previous education background, language, where they come from. And once they complete their assessment, I also ask them to write only a 500-word reflection on the teamwork and what they found difficult. Was it language? Was it why? Why do they think so? One of the things which comes up is the international students whose English, they speak it as a second language, and they often say that language was a problem, both theirs, they felt they couldn't communicate well, and also understanding the home students. And the home students, a very recurrent comment is that international students don't participate, they don't talk. Uh, Sorry. What is interesting is that very rarely, but it has happened, that international students, they might write in their reflective piece, which is anonymous, but if the student says like as a second speaker of English, then you know, okay, this is who they are. They might say something like, I speak very slow, I make pauses, and they home students, they jump in. They probably think I have finished. They don't give me the space to say, they don't give me the space to continue. And they feel like they don't have the patience to listen to me. So there are different kinds of perceptions about, again, speed. Uh, when I stop talking, does it mean that I'm finished, or am I still trying to come up with the word and um, construct the sentence? So these things about communication, managing to communicate, speed of talking, they come up very often. And I have been trying more recently, before I allocate students into the groups, to just show them a few slides. Now, these are the things that often happen in mixed culture, uh, teamwork. These are the challenges which international students face. These are the challenges that home students face. So you might feel like this, they are silent. You might feel like they don't want to participate, like try to think about speed, try to think about second language. I think since I've started doing that, I read about these kinds of issues less often, but again, it's not really properly researched, so I can't say whether, yeah,
No, but of course there
yeah,
is still great value in experience and
yeah,
seeing whether a particular intervention appears to be
mhm,
successful um, as you're starting it, perhaps on a small scale. And it's interesting what you say there, because you mentioned earlier on in this podcast that one of the issues that does come up from international students is a sense that it's difficult to participate, and
mhm,
B, their participation perhaps isn't valued as
yeah, very often that thing
very
about
often.
value, yeah,
Yeah, which that seems huge to me. I'm just thinking, if
mhm,
I were an international student, I'm thinking of some countries that are now sending large cohorts to the UK. You work for years at school to achieve the grades. You work for years to achieve a good enough language level to pass IELTS or the equivalent. Very often, the entire family is
mhm,
getting together to pay your fees. You arrive here at the age of 18, you're relatively young, nervous, you want to fit in, you want to impress your tutors, you want to make friends and impress your peers. And there is a lot of pressure to succeed, to not let your family down. So you
mhm,
must fit in, you must be successful. With all of that going on, to my mind, to walk out of a learning experience, a seminar, feeling that you're not really valued or appreciated by people, that must be devastating. And
mhm,
then to feel that it's your fault and you better not complain as well. that seems like a huge barrier to experiencing everything that a university has to offer, really. It seems like a much bigger issue than it sounds when we just say, oh, the international students don't say very much. When you think
Mhm.
about it, it seems a lot bigger to me. And perhaps that's just my perception, but that's what I'm picking up from what you're saying here. And the other thing that comes to mind, and I will stop and ask you a question, let you speak in a moment, but it's really interesting also what you're saying about the perceptions of the home students, that they tend to feel the international students don't contribute enough, and they jump in, interrupt, and dominate. Because working successfully in a global team
Mhm.
is so important for employability these days, so important for career success. And it really is a core skill that home students could benefit from if it were approached better at university. And that's what interests me about the interventions that you've been doing with your assessments and with pointing out some of the challenges of communication and how to overcome them. Is there more that can be done in that respect, do you think, to help home students and international students, as it were, integrate better, communicate
Yeah.
better?
Yeah, I think there is. I think unf probably unfortunately to some extent is um yeah, so the question is, can we learn? Can we improve? And definitely we can and we should. But do we want to? And I sometimes feel like there isn't as much willingness or openness to dedicate time to make those changes. Yeah, lecturers, educators, they have to do a lot. There is definitely um, that aspect. Um, but what I feel is the problem is that usually the people who, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question anymore, but usually the people who are really interested in making these changes, they go on, they find some courses on their own, they find readings on their own, they speak to other colleagues, they make these interventions. Students, if they're happy, I find it that a lot of the time they just don't complete the end of module surveys because they are happy. So you don't hear about the successful practices. Usually they fill out the end of module surveys if they are not happy. It's probably very similar to when we write a review for a restaurant. We
I was just
usually
going to
write
say
it,
that,
oh,
yeah.
it was disgusting, like, yeah. Um, and then the people who really need the training, they are the ones which are hard to reach. So my personal feeling is that there has to be some university-wide, department-wide commitment and policy that this is the training. It has to be done by everyone. It needs to be completed because, yeah, otherwise the people who will be doing more and more trainings will be the ones that preaching to the already converted. So the people who are already interested, they already want to improve, they understand the need. So the main challenge is how to reach out to those who are not so convinced they have to do anything about it.
We're talking about really how important it is to communicate better, to
Mhm.
include international students. And I was thinking almost of modeling behavior so that home students learn to communicate effectively on a global level as well. And you were saying that part of the challenge is ensuring that all staff can participate in
Yeah.
training like that, and reaching out to the people that need it. And that's very difficult to do. Well, let's turn that around because you're clearly quite passionate about this subject. You have been training people, you have changed your own approach to your teaching practice. Imagine I'm a vice chancellor.
Mm.
I'd love to be a vice chancellor. The money's great. Imagine I'm a vice chancellor. Make me a pitch to train all academic staff to improve communication with international students. Why should I, as a vice chancellor, authorise that?
Good question. Um, well, it won't really be a pitch, but I suppose we do care a lot about our reputation with international students because we want to be more international. We want to educate future leaders. We want to, we want students, young people who are ambitious to come to universities here in the UK. But if we fail to properly communicate and connect to these students, um, the feedback, the word of mouth, it won't be as positive as it could be. We obviously already are doing quite well. We are attracting students, but imagine how much better we can do. And we are also opening a lot of like satellite campuses in other countries. So we will be doing not less, but even more communication with people whose English is not their first language. So even if it has been something that we can get away with until now, the more that we engage with these kinds of partnerships, the more important it is becoming that we do have people who can properly communicate. Um, because if we have students and colleagues in other countries who feel that they're not valued, what kind of partnership are we hoping to establish with them? So yeah, I think that would be something along the lines of trying to convince maybe a vice chancellor why it is important, um, because it does matter for signing all those partnerships and making those partnerships work. Um, yeah, and having those students decide to come to us instead of the States or Canada or somewhere else. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that last point is also quite important. That it's we mustn't be too insular in the UK and think only of ourselves. The competitors are out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, the UK sector currently is in turmoil thanks to visa changes and rhetoric.
Mm.
We've been saved, I think, because Australia and Canada are doing similar things, but that will not necessarily be permanent. To use a
I
cultural,
recently Yeah,
go on, go
sorry,
on.
James. I recently had a student actually, and she has been, it's only one example. She has studied in the States and now came to the UK. And she was telling me that she felt so much more welcome in the States, and she feels like people there, lecturers and everyone, they're a bit more attuned to all of the challenges that international students face. And she was a bit disappointed because we advertise, as many UK universities, we advertise as international and global. And then she feels like when she came, um, yeah, that there wasn't that same level of um, being international and global and being willing to listen and communicate. Yeah, in the lectures, in the seminars. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that actually, because I've had the same experience. Again, small sample size, so it's not quantitative research in any way, but I had a very long conversation with another student who's done very well, studied in the UK, found it very difficult for all the reasons you've mentioned in terms of language and being valued and being included. Went off for a year's study in the States, in America, and the experience was totally different because the approach of staff was different. So yes, I again from a small sample, I would agree. I think you may well be right, and I know that you've been doing some work recently looking at I think the perceptions of members
Yeah.
of staff in higher education about the challenges that international students can experience. Can you tell me a little bit about that work, please?
Mhm. Yeah. So that work is with a colleague, we interviewed about 35 um, educators from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences about their experiences teaching students from culturally diverse backgrounds. And as one of the first steps, we were just asking, so what is cultural diversity? How would you define diversity of the students that you were teaching? And one of the things which were quite maybe interesting, because we are talking about language, usually the first things that colleagues mention are things like ethnicity, nationality, class very often, gender, sexuality sometimes. Very, very few people mention language. Very few people mention that it could be like language, which is really interesting because international students, they, as you said, take tests to come here. So obviously that's kind of like um, aspect. So language is not something that immediately comes to mind when they define the diversity of the students, and that links to inclusivity. So when colleagues talk about things that they can do to make their practice and their teaching more inclusive, they tend to focus on very technical things like making sure that people with visual impairment or something, they can read, they can access. They talk quite a lot about trying to find texts which are not going to maybe cause some kind of controversy because of sexuality, because of political something issues. And I think there is less of yeah, and sometimes they also worry about the examples, how international are the examples in terms of content. What I found really interesting in those interviews is that especially some of my colleagues who teach film, uh, it really impressed me that they do think about language, and sometimes when they are giving examples of yeah, uh, with film, if they find the same film with subtitles or in a different language, they allow the students to watch it in whatever language they feel most comfortable with. So that seemed like a really, really good practice. But generally, what I found quite interesting is that we think about the things that like ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, gender, not so often about language as an issue of diversity and inclusivity. Yeah.
That's interesting, and I think that's something in terms of diversity and inclusion that's actually reflected in the wider movement. In my experience, that can include the corporate world as well, where people don't stop and think of language as being a particular intersectional characteristic. So you conducted was it interviews with
Interviews, about an
interview
hour long, 34 people. Yeah. Mhm,
and what sort of range of academic disciplines did you have
mhm.
with that cohort?
So we have linguistics, we have film, um, the law school, what else? Languages and cultures, um, creative writing, sociology, politic philosophy and religion, and I think that is it. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So
Mhm.
quite a broad range of disciplines
Yeah.
there, not simply looking at an unrepresentative sample from one academic discipline
No.
particularly.
And we have about equal, sorry,
Sorry, no, go on.
we have about equal number of interviewees from each department within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was based from within your faculty.
Yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
going to ask, were you able to interview many STEM academics?
No, they were actually very interested. Well, we have 5 people who were very interested. They were from the STEM subjects, but we decided to limit it to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and maybe later on to expand it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That would be interesting because I would imagine I don't know the profile of students at Lancaster particularly, but STEM and business schools clearly generally they are the ones that are taking in big cohorts of international students. It'd be really interesting to compare the results that you found and see if they're reflected across those subjects too.
Mhm.
But I'm just thinking aloud at possibilities for future research. That really interests me. So, in a way, what we're saying is that the level of awareness of language and inclusion is not perhaps as high as it could be.
Mhm.
That's one of the findings or preliminary findings then from the research that you've done so far?
I would say that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what else came out from this research? Were there any other things that you found particularly striking?
I think on probably on the positive side, um, there are quite a few people who are already uh, making changes to their types of assessment uh, in terms of, for example, shortening assignments because they feel that for international students it's more challenging to write longer assignments, but also long assignments are fairly artificial. In the world outside of academia, blog posts are, for example, about 500 words, 1,000 words. So there are moves like that. Um, Also, there is more, some colleagues are leaving the kinds of essay questions a lot more open, and they're encouraging students to bring in examples from their own contexts, which is also very good because we want to prepare students to be able to work, yeah, globally. So we should be giving students the opportunity to learn and develop examples, not only necessarily about England, but when they presumably go back, they should be prepared to work back. So there were a lot of little initiatives with adjusting the types of assignments from length to the kinds of questions to the kinds of examples. Um,
I find that really interesting. Sorry to interrupt you,
mhm,
but two things strike me if I've understood you correctly. One is that I imagine some of this is going on already, but by looking at these issues and discussing them, making people aware can promote change.
mhm,
But the second thing that I find very interesting is that what you've talked about as positive change, it's not about othering people. We're not saying we're going to do this for the international
mhm,
students because we have a deficit model and they can't cope with proper assessments. We're saying we're going to shorten assessments for everyone because
mhm.
actually in the real world that is more useful. So it's the way that I'm understanding this is that in this case, by changing assessments now that we're aware of the needs of our international students, we are potentially enhancing the curriculum for everyone in
Yeah.
terms of employability. That is really interesting
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
quite a big positive change, I would
Yeah.
say, in my opinion, just from hearing what you've been saying there.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. That is absolutely the way that it's coming about. Uh, as you said, these are also um, practices which individuals who are interested, who are passionate, they go and out of their own yeah, passion, they make these changes. I think there is still fairly limited venue to share those kinds of practices, and to just have a list of these are practices, these are things that you can do. But also the kind of comment which I have gotten back is like, yeah, that people who do these changes, they're doing them without any kind of recognition. So it seems like what we really need is at institutional level to have that kind of approval, um, and be able to say that these are the things that we all should be doing. Um, because in a sense, what we have now is just individuals doing things and doing more work and changing things. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm really explaining it very well, but
No, you are. It sounds to
yeah,
me like I personally take the view that most people want to do a good job. Most people
yeah.
do actually care. Um, but it sounds like there's no institution-wide or sector-wide
Hmm.
way of really disseminating best practice to everyone, and rewarding those that do it was something you were
Hmm.
saying. People are not getting the recognition, which is a great shame. You must have the personal pride in doing a good job and hopefully good feedback from students. But yes, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be better if that were recognised
Hmm.
institutionally and you were
Yeah.
rewarded? on that basis. And then going back to what you were saying when you're talking about the need for greater training, if an institution could boast about that more widely to the
Yeah.
wider world, because then it's to everyone's advantage. What is good practice
Mm.
for giving useful feedback on work to international students?
Very difficult question. Yeah. Well, one of the things which I have found also as having been an international student is that a lot of the time, the feedback is clear, but I have found it sometimes difficult to understand how this feedback with these strengths and these weaknesses, how they map onto that range of the grade. So one of the things which I also hear a lot from students that have come to talk to me is that the feedback, I think, which is especially good, is the feedback which very clearly connects what the students has done well and not so well to the range or the band of the grade. And they refer to the marking criteria in their handbook. So if you have something like merit, and for merit you have argument, style, and understanding, the feedback is really clearly structured under these headings, and they will say, in terms of argument, you presented a strong argument about this, not so well about this. In terms of understanding, you show good understanding of the method, but you need to develop this and that. So I find it that that is one issue, because sometimes we write feedback, but we don't link it back to the marking criteria, and that is then difficult for the student to understand. But also avoiding, again, like colloquialisms in the feedback, avoiding statements which are too general. So we try to link to specific places in the text as much as possible. Very touchy subject. Again, English proficiency. So style, normally this is where we would comment on English proficiency. Well, not often, but I've had students who have come to talk to me and they say like, well, I got this grade and there's a whole paragraph in my feedback which focuses on my English language proficiency. And I say like, well, did you go and speak back to the tutor? Yes, I did. And they assured me that the grade is not only being marked down based on my language proficiency, but then if you have like 1/3 of your feedback all about your English language proficiency, it's kind of difficult as a student to yeah, to accept that.
Yeah.
Um
And
yeah,
so
so
as
I
a
think
result of that,
yeah.
inevitably it must feel that the effort you've put in, the quality of your thought, ideas and argument are perhaps being downgraded because of the way you've expressed them.
Mhm.
I think from what you're saying, that's likely to be the feeling that's going to be generated. Um, so what you're saying there, I think, is in giving feedback, tutors need to be really clear about the marking scheme,
Mhm.
stick very closely to that, give feedback on the bands within the marking scheme, and language is usually, isn't it, only one part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And we shouldn't forget that. Yeah.
Yeah, because you can have somebody who has written, I'll say an essay because that's
Mhm.
an easy one to visualize. Actually, they've covered the main points in the literature that they should have
Mhm.
researched. They have answered the question. So all of those aspects would fit perhaps into the merit box on
Mhm.
the marking scheme. And unfortunately, the way they've linked sentences, some of the grammar may be wrong, some of the spelling may be inaccurate. So yeah, by all means reflect on that and mark them down, because that is in the language part of the marking scheme. But that in itself need not detract from good marks and good feedback in the other aspects of the marking scheme. It is separating out those issues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And of course, we still have to comment on the language because it is part of the marking criteria. But yeah, just to do it really carefully and refer students to any services within the university. How can they improve? What can they do to write better? Yeah. The other thing which I also see sometimes is that we make a lot of comments based on style and structure because there's this very clear expectation about how the essay should be structured. But students sometimes come and say, yeah, but nobody told me that I need to have separate literature reviews, separate theoretical framework. So if I knew, I would have done it like that. As long as that content is there, even if the label of the heading is slightly different. Um, yeah, it should be okay. But again, it comes down to, um, yeah, probably different ways of doing it. Whereas I think in the US system, all students have writing 101 or something like that, where you learn those basics like this is the essay structure, this is how you write. I think when MA students come to the UK, we do have these modules which are academic writing, but they go on for a bit long and I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we really tell our students. I think sometimes the problem might be that we don't exactly tell our students how we want them to structure things. Then they write something and we mark them down because they didn't know how to structure. And that is actually the same for home students because home students, they come from all kinds of different backgrounds. Home students sometimes come to me as well and say, I've never written an essay like that before. Should I have a conclusion? Should it be long? What do I do? And do I need a big introduction? What do I do in a good introduction? So it's not like we kind of assume that students come in and they straight away they know everything. They just know it. They know how to write an essay, whether they're home, whether they're international, and we should just probably communicate a bit more and just set out our expectations and yeah, manage expectations. This is what we want you to do. Now you go away and do it.
And again, it comes down to that same point, isn't it? If we communicate clearly our expectations and the way in which we communicate itself is clear, the benefit is both for international students and home
Mhm,
students as well. So everybody wins, is
mhm.
essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, and in practice what you preach, because I had a very interesting conversation with a student who is actually retired and he's doing a degree now because that was their passion. The student he loves a band which is called Three Degrees. And he has 2 degrees already, so he's doing this MA degree so that he can have 3 degrees. So he's very good feedback from him this year because obviously he has no stakes, no nothing. And what did I want to say? Oh yeah, it goes back to like lead by example and practice what you preach. Because he was telling me that for a presentation that he had to do, he was marked down and taken points for having a very small font, or I don't know. But that lecturer, you should see the font on his slides. Why am I getting points taken off? And he goes and shows us those slides with much smaller font. I can barely read. I need my reading glasses. So yeah, that's another thing. Like, yeah, it's difficult, but I suppose like we have to lead by example. Yeah.
And small steps can make a big difference
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, isn't it? Increase your font size on the
Mm.
next slides,
Yeah.
and a lot would happen as a result.
I really hope that very soon we will have more institutional support and understanding that the kind of training in um, being better communicators. It's beneficial for everyone. It's beneficial for lecturers who are international, for home, for everyone, because we need to communicate better no matter what's our discipline. Even if it's mathematics, we have to communicate. And yeah, Tim always talks about reaching hearts and minds. So we need hearts and minds. And there are some developments at Lancaster and probably in other universities about curriculum transformation, willingness to do more training. And I really hope that we will be doing those kinds of trainings, because I do believe everyone can benefit from them. Even when I started as a lecturer, as a very young lecturer teaching, I was so scared of pauses and silences. So I've probably damaged a lot of international students myself, because in a seminar, when you ask a question and the students starts replying and they stop suddenly, you continue the sentence for them because you feel it's your failure as an educator. But I went to some trainings and somebody told me, look, no, you have to wait. Like, imagine that's you. Will you know so quickly what to say? Give them time. Don't be afraid of silences. And once I started to be less scared and really follow these simple trainings, simple trainings, I think it was better for everyone, for me, for the students probably. So the main point is like, we do need those trainings. We do need them and we can all benefit from them. That's it. Yeah.
That's such a lovely and positive note to end this podcast on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Dima. Thank you very
Yes,
much indeed.
for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you.